President Cyril Ramaphosa has signed the proclamation for the Basic Education Laws Amendment Act, marking a pivotal step in South Africa's education reform. Now, the Act focuses on equitable access to quality education, language policies, and universal Grade R access. The President has instructed Basic Education Minister Siviwe Gwarube to ensure its full implementation. To unpack its implications, we are now joined by the University of Johannesburg's education expert, Prof Mary Metcalfe. Thank you so much for your time this hour, Prof. So the BELA Act has been described as transformative. What do you see as its most significant provisions?
Thank you, Kolisi. It is transformative in that what it does is it takes forward, first of all, compulsory education from the age of the year in which the learner turns 6, which means we've now got 10 years of compulsory education rather than 9. This is important because it brings us into line with much of the policy internationally and in the continent, and it means that Grade R is now formally part of the schooling system and must receive the full support of the state. It means that children will be brought appropriately for their age, hopefully, into formal learning, and that will, firstly, I think is important, is lay the base for quality education. Secondly, it does have implications in terms of the consequences for the state, of the state being now obliged to ensure that we have sufficient places, properly supported teachers for all Grade R children. That's the first one. The second part of the transformation, which has received so much public debate and so much misinformation, is the question of the relative powers of school governing bodies and the state in relation to admission to public schools. This is not private schools, it's public schools. The President was absolutely correct to stress that the Constitution is the framework within which this transformation takes place. And the one important area of disinformation is that the Constitution is explicit that all learners have the right to be taught in a language of choice. So the public narrative that this is somehow going to do away with Afrikaans is completely wrong. What it says is in public schools, which are state-resourced, we must use all available places for the benefit of all of our children so that no child does not have access to a school because their language is not accommodated.
And Prof, I'm keen on finding out, how do you foresee schools implementing the Act's language policy? Because you just touched on that now, but let's also delve into the provisions and how they will be implemented effectively so.
Okay, so let me just say that there's also a little bit of misunderstanding, I think, of the President's statement, because he says the Act is fully in place, but particularly in relation to Grade R, we've got to look at norms and standards. In relation to language, any new ideas that may develop and add onto the regulatory framework, add on what already exists. And what already exists is not only the South African Schools Act and previous iterations of refining it in BELA, and what we learn from constitutional court cases. But what also exists is the admission policy that was published by the DBE in 2021. What also exists are regulations passed in provinces, and I will give you some examples of that. So in terms of language, what we know from our constitutional court rulings, what we know from the DBE regulations, is that the language policy of the school and the admission policy of the school, the law already allows that the head of department must review, that applications to enter a public school are made to the HOD, the head of department of each province, and that all language policies, admission policies are reviewed by the provincial head of department, that those language policies must be consistent with the Constitution, and we've got constitutional court rulings that say, yes, language of choice is fundamental in the Constitution, but it also says that a school governing body, when it looks at language policy, has a constitutional obligation not only to look at their notion of their community in a limited way, but to look at the broader notion of needs of the community in relation to constitutional obligations. So it's an invitation to look further than your historic community, but to make sure that everyone is included. So the major point that I want to make is that the provisions that already exist in legislation are well established. They affirm our constitutional principles, and any further adoption of norms and standards and regulations builds on what already exists. So we will be implementing BELA from the beginning of 2025, and we have, in terms of the existing regulations, sufficient room to move.
And
let me explain what I'm
sorry to come in there, Prof. And you just actually touched on...
It's not a legal vacuum. Sorry, I'm just saying it's not a legal vacuum. There's sufficient guidance in the existing law and regulations. Sorry, Mkolisi.
No problem, Prof. And you just actually spoke of looking further than your community, Prof. And, criticism across the board was that this act would actually give so much power, lots of power, in fact, to the HODs. What would you say to that?
It's completely appropriate. It's a power that they already have. It's been well established in law since 1996. And there's a lot of misinformation about the role of the head of department. The head of department doesn't, as an individual, review every case. The head of department makes sure that that is delegated across the system, so that at the right level within the system, there's meaningful engagement with schools on their admission policy, on their language policy. And as matters perhaps are unresolved, it then escalates up to the head of department to where her or his intervention is required. So the head of department of a province has to have those powers, because they are the individual which has the responsibility to make sure that state resources are used in order to ensure that all learners get access to a public school if that's what they wish and they're not in the private school system, and that they can do so in their language of choice. That is a responsibility given to the head of department in law.
And I know at the top of the conversation, we also touched on those two parts of the president's statement. And part one was that the BELA Act will be implemented in its entirety, right? And the second one was that the minister was to draw up norms and standards and regulations that will govern the implementation of the contentious sections of the bill. Let's talk about, how do you see this unfolding? Are we likely to see further delays?
Okay, so there's 2 points here. If you read the text of the president's statement says he's instructed the minister to draw up laws, timeframes of implementation, particularly with regard to the preparedness of the system for universal grade R access and the consequential regulations. So actually the president is emphasizing the preparedness of the system for grade R. Because that's not controversial, people are not picking that up. But if we say the norms and standards and consequential regulations, what we have is the DBE's admission policy, and in some provinces we have an admission policy that's also been regulated. And those will continue to be in place. So in case people are anxious, I must just refer to the DBE, the Gauteng department's admission policy. It reiterates the primacy of the state's responsibility in terms of access and language, and then it talks about feeder zones. It talks about how important it is that feeder zones actually meet the needs of the immediate community. They look at issues of curriculum, they look at issues of language. So there is already a very practical and I think defensible, and I think it's correct, it must be open to more public debate. That exists, it isn't taken away by the President's instruction to Minister Gwarube that she now needs to look at the regulations. We have existing regulations and policy in place that takes us forward. The process of what I think is important is building greater understanding, less misinformation, reassuring people that their language is not going to, their rights to language are not going to be taken away. Dealing with provinces that are complex like Gauteng, where we have massive new population moving in, changing demographics, pressure on schools, requires an approach that is sensitive to building that understanding and has to build the capacity to manage change in a school which may become dual medium or parallel medium, which is likely to be the case where a school is underutilized.
And I want us to turn focus now to the operational side of this. You know, the President highlighted universal grade R access, and you just touched on some of the challenges that provinces such as Gauteng currently face. What challenges does the system face in achieving this, particularly when we look at the universal grade R access?
Okay, so with universal grade R access, there was a lot of discussion in Parliament in relation to the timeframes for implementing universal grade R access. What was presented in the parliamentary hearings are the costs for provinces in terms of reaching full enrollment in grade R. What we know from those presentations is that across the country, and it's different across different provinces, it's going to cost 5.2 billion additionally to the salary bill every year. That's because we need to be employing additional teachers in order to reach all children. And the second is that we've got to equalize the conditions of service. So across the country, 5 billion. That is an enormous amount, and you know that there are financial pressures. That amount is going to have to be planned for in the planning and data and foreseeable fiscal envelope for each of the provinces. So this starts becoming provincially specific. The second major cost is in order to provide the infrastructure, the Treasury and Financial and Fiscal Commission's overall, and the DBE's overall estimates that this is going to be about 12.4 billion. Now, infrastructure doesn't happen like that. Infrastructure needs planning, it depends on capacity, it depends on budget. So the implementation of grade R, in my projection and in terms of my understanding, is going to be based on the individual capacity, individual realities of each province, and it cannot be immediate in 2025 in any province. If let's look at Gauteng as your example, it's a good example. Gauteng has been working hard to get their online enrollment system such that all learners prior to the implementation of BELA from grade 1 and up are in schools. To now start a process of compulsory grade R and perhaps an online registration, it just seems impossible to me. And Gauteng will, like all other provinces, have to look at salaries, infrastructure, how to achieve it over time. And I think the President is correct to emphasize that implementation of this has to be a planned process.
And still on that, Prof, we still have the minister who's, of course, going to, draw up the norms and standards for this. What do you think the minister should prioritize to ensure the successful rollout of the Act?
Froze. Damn.
We still have you, Prof. Let me just rehash that question again. We were just talking about the minister who's actually going to, draft those norms and standards. What do you think the minister should prioritize to ensure the successful rollout of the Act?
Well, for BELA and Grade R, she needs to engage with each provinces to have an evidence-based approach to, when they have the necessary resources, to employ the teachers, prepare the infrastructure, and, by the way, Grade R then becomes formally part of the GET phase of education, general education and training. It needs not only to have the infrastructure and the teachers, but it also needs to have the subject advisors as part of the foundation phase. We need more subject advisors. It's about furniture, etc. In terms of the implementation of what has been the source of much of the misinformation and much of the anger, which is the relative powers of the school governing body and the department in relation to admission policy and language policy. I think that probably what is most important is to make sure that the principles in the Constitution, the principles that are carried forward in the legislation, in the regulations, in the guidelines, have an inclusive process of reassuring people across the spectrum. So there's a lot of people who feel that the attacks on BELA are an attack on the entire legislative framework for education, as if there isn't already a great deal of progress that has been made from the apartheid past and which is consolidated not only in legislation but also in practice. We need to build on the gains that the country has made. On the other hand, the misinformation about this will mean that there will no longer, for example, be Afrikaans medium schools. We're going to lose them. Also needs to be countered. And that needs to be done in a spirit of genuine commitment to listen, to nation build, to build a consensus that will assist education. We need children in schools. We need them to be learning in a school in a language environment that supports their needs. And that is also related to the culture of the school, how inclusive it is, how accommodating it is of diversity, the way it is celebrated. So in the technicalities, let's not forget the emotions, because that can completely undo what is clear technically. Let's build consensus and mutual understanding.
And you speak on building on the gains that this country has had so far. Can this act really bridge the gaps in the educational inequality across South Africa? Because as much as this could also be, a light at the end of the tunnel, but there are some challenges that we've rightfully also spoken about throughout the course of our chat. So do you think that this can really bridge the gaps in the educational sector in the country?
Legislation is just one component of the architecture for achieving equality. Other components that are equally important is the fiscal framework, to make sure that we use the resources that we have in an economically constrained environment efficiently, effectively, that we focus on what's important and that we plan properly to achieve what's important. I'll give you an example. The achievement of literacy and numeracy in the foundation phase is the basis of all subsequent learning in the system. It needs to be properly resourced. It needs to be properly planned for. That focus should not be dissipated by a range of competing alternatives. We have to prioritize, we have to plan for it, and we have to use our resources appropriately. So the legislation provides one component of that architecture of achieving equality. The planning process and the resourcing process is also important. And then we need to have a capable public service, a capable principled public service that is able to do what must be done to support our teachers to be able to teach effectively with the appropriate resources, with a commitment, with hope and certainty that they will be supported in their work.
And Prof, as you also say, there are so many components to this discussion that we are having right now, and the fear across the board has been how is this likely to unfold? As we have a schooling system, many have said, battles with getting just the basics right. Do you think we will get it right?
I think that we do have a capable and committed teaching force, capable and committed on the whole, officials. I think that the missing part for me is the adequate planning. And the planning needs to become much more evidence-based, rooted in links between planning and resource allocation, links between planning and monitoring, making sure that the grand ideas that we have, which sound attractive and sound compelling, are properly resourced and are properly implemented, and that we know that they are being implemented and we know where the weaknesses are. That requires an honest and a frank conversation, rather than a conversation which often in the public space tends to be defensive, tends to be saying, yes, but everything's fine. We need to know when things are not fine. It depends on making sure that all communities are engaged in making schools better where they live. We have, for example, in Gauteng, such a movement from schools which perhaps are not performing as well as they should, to schools which require learners to be transported at some distance from their home and at great risk, not only physically, but also emotionally and socially in terms of those risks. We need to re-inspire communities to say, this is our school governing body, these are our teachers, let's support the teachers, let's support the school to be better. Now that is something that we need across the country. We need to, as society, step up and do more to make sure that public schools are schools that are supported and strengthened. Those public schools are deeply influenced by social ills. There's many schools where parents do not want their children to go to the local school because they see, for example, drug abuse, alcoholism, bullying, and they are desperate to find alternatives. But the alternative that we must not let fall off the table is to focus on quality where we live.
Listen, Prof, it's always great chatting to you. Thank you very much. That's Prof Mary Metcalfe, who's from the University of Johannesburg, and she's an education expert there.